So I'm delighted that our final speaker this morning is a man who's done more than most to champion some of these ideas within the broader corporate and financial world. As Chief Executive of Unilever for a decade, Paul Polman showed that putting sustainability and purpose at the very heart of business strategy could drive consistent long-term growth. Paul was also part of the UN group that developed the SDGs and remains an SDG advocate. And through his new venture, Imagine, he hopes to promote implementation of the goals through transformational leadership. Paul has previously described the SDGs as the greatest economic opportunity of a lifetime. Thanks for that, Paul. So who better to talk to us about what all this means for the future of business and investment? Paul has kindly agreed to answer some questions at the end. So if you have your Slido app, please do put some questions on there, which Paul will handle at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Polman.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Phil, for the introduction. And as I was mentioning to Richard, I'm here for Richard, actually, and Ronnie Cohen, who got me here, and he's hard to refuse because we need him for a lot of other things, and sometimes you have to pay back your dues. But I have a great respect for Richard and what Richard is doing, and actually speaking after him is probably not the easiest job because he's probably one of the best communicators in the world. I remember recognizing him once at Unilever for, we have an annual award for people that are true change makers, and he's one of them. And he got up and he talked about Unilever better than I could even after. So it turned out that obviously his dad had worked his whole life for Unilever, and it's in his DNA more than even we had there. So my admiration for Richard went even up more. You know, the number 17 is an interesting number because it's actually a highly spiritual number. And it's not a coincidence. I call it, it's a sign that you find these number 17s, as Phil was explaining. It actually is, it stands for peace and love for humanity. And I think that's exactly what you're trying to do with Brit's fund management. It deals with insights, it deals with responsibility, it stands for discipline, strength, compassion, wisdom, but above all, spiritual consciousness. So take that as a given, but I don't think that's a coincidence. I also want to thank you for this opportunity, but above all for what you're doing. As you say, 1 billion is a good start. I just came from San Francisco. I'm on the advisory board for the Rice Fund. And obviously the area of impact investing is now about 500 billion. It's double the year before. It's only coming up from the last 10 years. Half of these funds are for the first time. Even the KKRs and the BlackRocks and the Blackstones put impact behind it. You know, it's a little bit like when I was at Unilever. To earn more money and get your stock price up, you put blockchain behind it, and now it seems to you put impact behind it. And a lot of them are doing that. But nevertheless, I think that market is going very fast. The market for, obviously, responsible investing, however we define that, we can talk that later, is equally moving up. People estimate it's about $30 trillion right now. So you'd be daft not to look at a system where you invest in something that protects yourself for now and also for the future and future generations. And Bridges Capital's statement here that, which obviously your impact investing for building a better future for people and planet, and the firm belief that that also drives economic value, I can obviously 100% subscribe to. Richard undoubtedly talked about the sense of urgency. I don't want to be a doomsday person here, so don't take any of my comments as doomsday. I actually think it's the best time to be born in this wonderful planet. People live longer, healthier lives. More people are included in the workforce. Every day, 200,000 people get lifted out of poverty. 250,000 people have access to clean drinking water and sanitation. You know, we've done a hell of a job in the last 20, 30 years, lifting more people out of poverty than any time in human history. Obviously, China has been a big factor of that, but so many other countries. But there's no doubt that this is a tale of two cities. It's no doubt that the way we have lifted all these people out of poverty, we are starting to discover even more so now, it is really unsustainable. I think the financial crisis in 2006, 2007 brought to our attention that a system that was based on high levels of government or private debt overconsumption in parts of the world, and frankly, leaving too many people behind is a system that is unsustainable. And unfortunately, we've not learned that lesson in the last 10 years. We've actually made it worse. We are somehow in a system that's paralyzed. And the reason we're paralyzed as a humanity is we are operating in boundaries that put straitjackets on us. I don't think people are bad people, the opposite. Otherwise, I wouldn't have the appetite to live on this planet. I think people are basically born to be good people. I think all of us have little diamonds in ourselves that can shine, but collectively we're not able to do that. So why is that? Why is that? So one of the reasons is obviously that we've become increasingly more short-term. We are operating within frameworks that make us behave in certain ways. If I put it very simple, in Unilever, if I would reward all of our salespeople on the number of orders they would write, they're going to write a lot of orders. But you can imagine that these orders would be probably very small because the incentive is on the number of orders. If I give them the incentives on customer service, they'd behave totally differently. We're in the wrong incentive systems in this world. We reward the things that frankly don't count, and we don't reward the things that count. It's actually sad if you look at that from a definition of Milton Friedman's, the business for business is business, a very narrow definition that I think we've all come back from now. We don't have to explain that too much to this audience. But the same is for GDP. It's very sad that when you have an oil spill in the Gulf, the GDP goes up. When you have a war and a bombing now in Saudi, the GDP goes up. When we have more air pollution in London and 8 million people die prematurely, our GDP goes up. But when we have high quality education, when we have no wars, when we have peace and tranquility, or when we have air that we breathe, we somehow don't give that a value. And yet it is impossible to address these global issues if we don't start to redefine our definitions of success. It's a very important thing that we need to do. And what is difficult is that the number of challenges that we have right now are probably too much for many of the people to comprehend. That complexity, that systemic thinking that is needed to solve them is overwhelming. And when things are overwhelming to people, climate change being an example of that, people actually become shorter term. It's a little bit of a survival instinct of the human being. And we tend to discount too much the longer term, don't want to deal with that. It's true, it's not easy to be a CEO nowadays in this world. The average tenure of a CEO is 4.5 years. The only one that was pretty mad that I was 10 years CEO of Unilever was my wife. She thought, why do you always have to be different than the statistics? but it's difficult to be a CEO. Many of them are not prepared for the job. Absolutely not. It requires skill sets that nobody has been trained for. It's also difficult to run a publicly traded company. When I was born in 1956, the average length of a publicly traded company in the US, where the data are available for, was 67 years. Currently, the average length of a publicly traded company in America has dropped down to 17 years. I was under the assumption that we were built to last. Great institutions that I worked for, the P&Gs, the Nestle's, or the Unilevers, have a 150-year history. But that's not the case for most. And increasingly, that time is shorter and shorter. Built to sell or built to bankrupt, or built to enrich themselves off at the expense of others. Now, it's not so easy because the changes that we have to make are quite dramatic. Never in the history of mankind did we have to decarbonize the global economy. We're carbon junkies. Now, we need carbon. We couldn't live without carbon, so I'm not against carbon. But to put carbon in the atmosphere is not very good, to be honest. And the way we're doing that and the quantities we're doing that makes it even worse. We cannot grow our economies without carbon. And the task we have at hand is pretty challenging. If you want to stay below 2 degrees, which is an absolute freaking disaster, you really need to go for 1.5 degrees, which is net zero by 2050. It's doable if we want that. There's many plans out there, including of the European Climate Commission, that Adair Turner, that clearly shows that with a small investment we can do that. But if you want to stay at 2 degrees, to keep the math simple, it means that we have to reduce carbon by 40% in absolute in the next 20 years. Otherwise, you won't get there. But in the next 20 years, our global economy continues to grow at 2 to 3%, which means it doubles. Which, in other words, you have to reduce carbon per economic output unit, if you want to, by 80%. I don't think people are really aware of that scale of the magnitude of change that needs to happen. Nor are few people aware, certainly not at political level, of what really is going on with climate change or what they need to do. One of the big mistakes we made at the COP21 which was a very successful COP, is that we targeted the environmental ministers, which were level 2, level 3 ministers in many countries, and we forgot actually to target the finance ministers. I still regret that, but now we have a big movement globally, which is called the Finance Ministers for Climate Action. So we've learned from that, but it's very hard still to get it into government policy. The second thing we have to do is to move our economy, not even anymore to a circular economy. I just heard the word being mentioned. Circular is not enough anymore. This year, on July 29th, we used up all the resources that this world could replenish. And that number is getting every day earlier and earlier. We're living already this year of 60% more use of resources than this world can replenish. You know, some people say we should be merely stewards looking after our planet for our future generations. We are rapidly stealing from our future generations. That is what we are doing. Hubert Reeves said it well when he said, he's a philosopher from Canada, he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And that's exactly what we are doing. Next to climate change and the circular economy, which I would argue has to be regenerative economy, totally feasible. By the way, just as a side comment, nature doesn't know any waste. Nature doesn't know any waste. Waste is invented by us, and we think it's totally acceptable. When I ran Unilever, I said, one day I got this sort of revelation that said, we're going to run all of our 572 factories at zero waste to landfill. And often a lot of that ends in the oceans, as you well know, with the plastic disaster that we have right now. But people said it's impossible. I said, okay, if it's impossible, take 5 years. I always believe in setting targets that are a little bit audacious, targets that you feel uncomfortable with, and certainly targets that you don't know how to achieve. There are very few CEOs and very few governments that set targets that they don't know how to achieve. Hence, it's all straight line management. Hence, it's business as usual. Hence, we don't change anything we need to change. But if you set uncomfortable targets, like we did in Unilever, decouple growth from environmental impact, reaching an extra 1 billion people with their social impact, running all your factories as a sub-target at zero waste, people start to think. And lo and behold, in 3 years' time, we achieved that. In 3 years' time, we achieved that. Many of these materials that would have gone to waste, we actually could upscale and get more value out of it than, in some cases, even selling some of our products. So, circular or regenerative economy, decarbonizing, moving the financial markets to the longer term. It's an absolute must. You cannot solve the issues of climate change or food security or income inequality if you run the rat race of quarterly reporting. It's just impossible. And yet the financial market, if you like it or not, the numbers would support, is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. 75% of the CEOs of the CFOs of companies even say that they make the wrong decisions to make the quarter versus the right decisions to run your businesses long term. The pressures from the boards, the incentive systems amongst the asset managers. Still too many people feel greed is good, unfortunately. But the reality is that generosity long term will always win. If we don't start to put the interest of others, and certainly the future generations ahead of our own, we're not going to get out of this mess that we're in. So we have to move these financial markets to the longer term, not only by statements or big declarations that all of a sudden we need to run a purpose, and then running a big company yourself that misses any actions in that respect, but by actually doing these things. And it will be good for all of us. By the way, we're killing the goose with the golden eggs. If I would be in your profession, I would be scared stiff. The number of publicly traded companies in the US has halved. Besides that, it's a tragedy for the common population to participate in wealth creation. It is also obviously a tragedy for yourself because your industry is disappearing under your nose. And half of it becomes foo-foo dust with financial instruments you create yourself to keep yourselves happy that have nothing to do with the real economy. The fourth thing we need to do is to make it more of an inclusive growth. You know, I always go to Davos. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I go because Richard also goes. I thought I'd pull him in to get some justification here. But Oxfam always publishes a study, you know, and every year they study, they give you the statistics on poverty in this world. This year, in January, for the first time, Oxfam published a study that said that the bottom 3.8 billion people of this world, the bottom 3.8 billion people, saw their incomes go down by a combined 11%. It's the first time that the poorest people in this world were going down by 11%, if I'm not clear. And just the billionaires itself saw their net wealth increase by 12%. The increase of the billionaires by 12% is the equivalent of about $900 billion. $900 billion. If we would just have taken 0.5% of that money, we would have been able to put 240 million children in school that are currently deprived from education. If you're asking for a good investment, here you have one. We would have been able to provide 4 or 5 million children with health care and prevent them from dying prematurely. And frankly, they could have been our children. We're just damn lucky that we were born in this part of the world. If there is a gross violation to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, here you have one. And we're all living it. By living this irresponsibly, we are responsible. We are doing that. And every day that we wait, someone else is going to suffer because of our lack of awareness or lack of caring in the end of the day. I think it's more the latter one. Now here's a killer statistic for you on income inequality, if you wouldn't believe one. I just came back from the US, and I was talking to some organizations there. The top 2,000 US households, the richest 2,000 US households, have now a combined wealth of $4.2 trillion. $4.2 trillion. Now you think they're generous. Who thinks they're generous? Raise your hands. All the billions that Bill Gates gave away, just raise your hands. They are generous. Raise your hands. Who thinks they're generous? Come on. You guys are lazy. At least raise your hands. If you don't want to move the market to the long term, raise at least your hands. Raise your hands. Who thinks they're generous? Okay, it's about 2/3 of you. Well, here are the statistics. The combined donations of these billionaires that have $4.2 trillion is $45 billion. Sounds like a lot. But $45 billion is 1.2% of their wealth. I don't want to talk about my donations, but I think lots of us do more than the 1.2%. Now here's the interesting statistic. They are growing their money much faster, in fact at double the rate, than that they're giving away their money. So what they're giving away is just a pimple. In fact, they've seen their net wealth double in the last 4 years. In 4 years. Giving away 45 billion is not really a lot. If we would take these 4.2 trillion of these people, or take half of it, you can never use anyway, and put this into these causes, we can finance the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, we're not short on money in this world. Did you know that half of this wealth has 0 or negative interest rates? Now, what does this mean if half of the world has 0 or negative interest rates? Have you ever thought about that, what that means? Actually means that we're crazy. It means that we have decided to produce a lot of stuff that deprives us, the future generations, from living. Many people now from having a decent life. Because we like producing stuff to turn it into money. That's what capitalism does. And we're turning it into more money and more money and more money to then tell each other that the money isn't worth anything. That's why we have 0 or negative interest rates. We're busy with keeping ourselves busy doing something that doesn't do anything. It's basically what we're doing. So if we would take that money and put it behind climate change, put it behind poverty, put it behind solving inequality, we could create that, with that same money, do something useful. We could create a better world for all. Because the alternative is not very pretty. The alternative of climate change at its current pattern is the extinction of human beings. Right now, we're losing species at 1,000, we're losing 1 million species at 10 to 100 times more than the historical pattern that we have. When is it our turn? Right now, we're driving more people into poverty than at any time. Why do we do this? The yellow jackets is just the tip of the iceberg. How many more Brexits or disasters do you want to have that are playing out right under our nose here in the UK? We're asking for it? No, we're not even asking for it. We're actively stimulating it. That's what I'm telling you. So then we all say, oh my gosh, what do we need to do? It's too much. We need to depend on governments. Well, it is true that governments are in a mess right now. We only see populism coming up, and we see governments making the wrong decisions. No question about it. Bolsonaro in Brazil is a disaster for climate change. And so is Erdogan and Putin and many of the others. Not to talk about this guy in the US, I forgot his name. So it is a, you know, historically we have depended on governments. And they've given us a lot of opportunities. I wouldn't be standing here were it not for them. Now it's a little bit difficult. Shouldn't we then take that responsibility? Shouldn't we then fill that void? Shouldn't we then say we step up to the plate? Instead of, I'm doing it, but they're not doing it. The problem is here. If they would only behave, no. Take your own responsibilities. Why shouldn't we collectively behave? Why I believe in the private sector is it's 60% of the global GDP. It's 80% of the financial flows. It's 90% of the job creation. Business can simply not be a bystander in a system that gives it life in the first place, nor can business succeed in societies that fail. It's so obvious. It's so obvious. So we need to step up to the plate and need to start de-risking the political process. Now the beauty is we have a plan, for heaven's sake, on a silver platter. In September 2015, 193 countries at the UN signed something called the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't need to bother you with that, but it has a simple objective to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. What's wrong with that? 17 goals actually will get you there. I know it's complex, 17 goals. An average CEO at best can remember the business he's in, the name of his wife if he's lucky, and how much money he earns. So 17 goals is difficult. That's why we have Richard to help us communicate it better. And give it some colors and dance around it and make it fun. But that's the complexity we have in the world. We did a study where we asked Mark Malloch Brown to help get this into the minds of these CEOs, because I just explained to you the difficulty that they have. So how can we translate it simply? And we looked at 4 areas. We looked at energy transition, mobility, cities, and health and well-being. And just looking at these 4 areas, we saw an opportunity of $12 trillion. And more importantly, creating 380 million jobs. At the time, frankly, that we needed a lot. Perhaps not here, but in some parts of the world. An enormous business plan. In fact, I would argue, for anybody that would really spend some time on it, that we are at the point right now, because we've waited so long to do something about it, we're actually at the point right now that the cost of not acting is becoming higher than the cost of acting. The Sustainable Development Goals require an investment of anywhere between $3 to $5 trillion a year, which might sound a lot to people, but frankly, on a global economy, make it roughly 90 to 100 trillion. It's not that much. So the 3 to 5 trillion, unfortunately, we're only investing about a trillion and a half against it. So there's a gap. And that gap cannot come from governments. All the ODAs that governments give, the UK here being a good one, having stuck to the 0.7%, but all the ODAs that the governments globally give is only 150 billion. 150 billion, 3 to 5 trillion, Houston, we have a problem. That's why we need to unlock the financial sector. And I would argue now that because we've waited so much, we are at the point that the cost of not acting is actually costing us more than the cost of acting. So it's cheaper to do something about it than to pay the consequences. So it makes sense, you're all nodding your heads. But let me tell you something that might not make sense to you. The cost we are incurring on each of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals is currently already higher than what we need to invest to achieve all of the goals. You get this? And you still think you're the most intelligent species. The cost for each of these goals that we're incurring is already higher than all of the goals. Goal number 13, climate action, climate mitigation. The total cost that this world is currently incurring of our inattitude going up like this on a daily basis is, according to the IMF, $5.3 trillion. The cost we are incurring currently, goal number 5, gender equality. The cost we are incurring currently of not taking care of the equal rights, by the way, or opportunities for the genders. There's no country in the world where women have the same right as men. Just giving them access to financing, education, or land rights would unlock the global economy by $26 trillion. Goal number 16, peace and justice. This world prefers to spend 9 to 11% of its global GDP on conflict prevention and wars, and the numbers are going up. That's 2 to 3 times as much than the implementation of the total Sustainable Development Goals. What the heck are we doing? What the heck are we doing? And then the financial community doesn't see the economic benefits? How blind are they? I ran the Unilever business entirely around the Sustainable Development Goals, especially after I was on the high-level panel helping develop them. It just got into my DNA. We ran it for the last 5 years on a 19% return on invested capital. We had a 300% total shareholder return over the 10 years. Am I proud of it? Hell no. How do I explain that even to my 91-year-old mother who sees her pension go down every week because we're behaving irresponsibly? Because we're behaving as if banks were too big to fail and people were too small to matter. And yet we have the plans right in front of us. And anybody that would just see this would actually drive to glory. I work a lot with the blind, with my own foundation, and my wife, and Helen Keller went to Perkins, School of the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts. And she said she was blind and deaf. So she was deaf-blind. And she said, you know, the worst thing is not being blind. The worst thing is having eyes and not being able to see. That's what we're doing. We're having eyes and not being able to see. Our food system is probably the biggest mess we have created. If you come from Mars right now and you figure out how we do the food system, what are you going to think? On the one hand, we say we can only do it by cutting the lungs or the forests of this world, at an increasing rate, by the way. We're cutting, we lost last year the size of a country of New Zealand. The deforestation in Brazil is up 94% versus a year ago. We're not able to produce food without cutting trees. Then we keep the poor farmers as poor as we can. 75% of the people that live in poverty are poor subsistence farmers, basically trying to starve them to death. Then we keep 826 million people hungry, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. Numbers going up. Then we have the audacity to not provide enough nutrition to 160 million children every year who end up being stunted, scarred for the rest of their lives. By the way, in sub-Saharan Africa, that's 10 to 15% of some of their economies. Then we have the audacity to waste 30–40% of the food as if it doesn't mean anything. If food waste was a country, it would be the 3rd biggest emitter after China and the US. Just food waste alone. And then you think that's enough. Stop. No, we're creating the biggest epidemic diabetes too, the biggest epidemic this world has ever seen, on the other side of the equation with diabetes. Over 1 billion people are now obese. 2.5 billion people are overweight and obese. That's our food system. Welcome from Mars. I'm flying back. You know, the total cost of this broken food system is $12 trillion to society. Did you know that it only costs $350 billion to fix it? And that you know that if you would fix it, these negative costs to society, these $12 trillion, you could turn around in $4.5 trillion positive. We are sitting on the biggest investment opportunity the human world has ever invented. And I could go on and on and on and entertain you for the next 5 hours with more statistics, but I hope I've made my point. So what's preventing us from doing anything? Some of the billionaires in this world might think they need to go to space to find the answer. I frankly think they're planning to go to space to leave us with the mess ourselves here. That's what they're really doing. But you don't need to go to Pluto or Mars to find an answer, nor do you need more PhDs. Don't we know how to grow food and feed people in a sustainable way? Don't we know how to build houses for the homeless? And frankly, don't we know how to create energy from green energy? Solar costs have come down 65% in the last 5 years alone. In most countries of the world, it's now cheaper than coal. And yet, still 2/3 of the investors are investing in coal, as if it doesn't matter. Sleeping at the wheel. By the way, we're sitting on $2 to $3 trillion at least on the low side of stranded assets on carbon on balance sheets of companies. Did you know that the 2007-2008 Lehman crisis if you want to call it that way, was only caused by $250 billion. Wait for it to happen if you want to. Wait for it to happen. Anyway, I don't know where we are right now, other than what we need to do and what you can do to help solve some of the challenges that we have. The first one, very simply, is help move the financial markets to the longer term. I talked about that. I don't want to spend too much time on it anymore, but you need to provide some breathing room to do that. The second thing is to put a price or put a measure what we treasure. Put a price on some of these externalities is not a bad thing. Put a price on carbon is a good thing. By the way, we now have 26% of the world on carbon pricing, and there is not one of these economies that suffers. We actually see an inverse correlation, that if you have pricing on carbon or cap and trade systems, the economies actually do better, not worse. So putting a price on things and fighting for that is absolutely important. People say that accountants are going to change the world. I actually believe that. Accountants are going to change the world. If we don't put these values on them, we're not going to get there. So the efforts that you're doing or that you can participate in with the World Benchmarking Alliance efforts and many of the others going on here is an absolute must. The third thing is to think differently about partnerships. First of all, in your investment portfolios, be active investors. Don't be these activists that are just out for their own returns. We have enough of the Dan Lopez's and the Peltzes of this world, if you want to. We don't want those activists. We want people that actively work with companies to understand that these companies run their businesses responsibly. How many are actually asking companies to ensure that they have gender balance? Clearly not enough. We only have about 20 companies that joined the 30% club in the UK even. How many women are in this audience? A little bit better, but not much. Still 5% of the CEOs are women in the world today. When I became Unilever CEO, my whole board was 50% Dutch and 50% British, even worse, and they were all men. And it took me 2 or 3 years to have 50% women and to have a board that reflects the whole world. And it helps, it makes the companies better. We have enough data on that. A company that is more gender diverse has better performance. We have enough data on that. A company that has a better culture and higher engagement has higher performance. We have enough data on that. A company that internalizes a price on carbon, thinks about it, makes their plans about it, has better returns. We have enough data on that. A company that looks at their value chain and looks at human rights and fair wages and fights actively to not have slave labor or child labor has a better return. We have enough data on that. So become an activist investor and demand from companies that they behave the way that they should behave. There's something about the golden rule in this world that simply says, do unto others as you would like to have done to yourselves. If we could just live by that principle. It's just amazing how many CEOs are not willing to work actively to get corruption or child labor or slave labor out of their value chains. By not doing so, in my opinion, they communicate that it's okay for their children to be in slave labor and child labor. By not actively working your carbon plans, by so doing, it's okay for your family to die prematurely of air pollution. We need to take that responsibility as investors to demand that that money gets done properly. So become active investors. It is not anymore profit and purpose. No, it is profit through purpose. It's a slightly different thing. It is not anymore CSR, corporate social responsibility. It's actually responsible social corporations that we need. Too many still think that they can outsource their supply chain, and by doing so also outsource their responsibilities. That doesn't work anymore. You have to take a responsibility of your total global footprint. And companies that do that will do well. So work on your accounting, work on your long term, work on your purpose and driving companies to purpose. And then last but not least, I would say work on your partnerships. The challenges that we have is a little bit like Einstein, the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is not going to happen. So we have challenges here that are clearly bigger than each of us individually can do. It's a wonderful African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. I think it's now the time that we go together on many of these things. And when and where we have these partnerships, some of them in your case studies were well explained, we actually can move mountains. And we need to create these partnerships more and more that tip it. One of these partnerships actually is in the financial markets. It clearly doesn't get enough money yet towards the sustainable development goals. If that is the case, there's an issue with risk and return perception. Some of it might be perception that we then need to work, and that's probably doable, but some also might be reality. I realize that. So why don't we think differently of our global financial system? Why don't we think differently about the roles of world banks or multilateral banks to not just finance projects and often uselessly spending their money, but, for example, taking risk parts. Why don't we change the financial industry into some of the things that you are leading here with social or development impact bonds? Why don't we look much better and more aggressively at blended financing, performance bonds? We've done that with some of the countries where we work together with governments or with the IFC and others. I know it's hard work, I know it's not easy, but when and where we put those together, we actually move things forward faster than if we're trying to do it alone. So look at what partnership means in your industries. Partnership in your industry means advocacy collectively. If things happen that are not right, this industry needs to speak up. The financial industry has been scarred. The financial industry is very low on the trust ladder, and that's true in most countries according to the Edelman Service. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to speak up for what is right. I was very happy to see the BRT statement of 181 companies in the US and saying we are doing a long-term multi-stakeholder model. But you also then have to put action behind that to move it forward, and you have to speak up. Some of the CEOs are doing that on issues of LGBT or the refugees, separation of the kids from their parents, or the gun violence now. Some of these stand up. But are you really standing up to things? And are you really putting into words what you believe? How many of the banks are still financing unsustainable supply chains and not actively taking part in converting that? How many of the banks spoke up when we had the fires in Brazil and say we need to do something else? How many of the banks speak up and say we need to move the financial markets to the longer term and change some of the systems that are now outright dysfunctional? You don't hear them. A few, seldom. And if there are only a few, most likely they get shut down by the press or by us ourselves because we don't like them to be successful. Ultimately, to solve all the things that I've talked about, as I mentioned before, it's not about Mars, it's not about PhDs, it's not about Jupiter, it's about human willpower. I just end with a very simple question. Do we really care? And that's a question for you individually to answer. It's only just one thing I can tell you, that you're the darn lucky bunch. You are born in a part of the world that you didn't have to worry about clean drinking water or sanitation. So it brought you past the age of 5, unlike 4 million other children in this world. You didn't have to worry either of getting enough food. You probably had too much of it. So that puts you apart from the 820 million people that go to bed hungry. I don't think you had to worry about education probably, otherwise you wouldn't have been sitting here. That puts you ahead of 2/3 of the world population that doesn't have access to education or quality education. And you probably found a decent job that made you independent. To be able to sit here, have a very enjoyable day, live and work where you want, and be merry. Well, you've just arrived at 2% of the world population. If you are 2% of the world population, you have won the lottery ticket of life. Now, if you have won the lottery ticket of life, it is your duty to put yourselves to the service of others. The Dalai Lama said it well when he said that if you seek enlightenment just to enhance yourself and your own causes, you miss purpose. But if you seek enlightenment to help others achieve their causes, you are with purpose. My simple message to you is live a life with purpose. Thank you very much.